it's decades since we had a serious argument about tariffs, and it's many, many decades since we had tariffs at any level, even vaguely approaching what we have now.
Now, the ripples of Donald Trump's trade war continue to rock the UK and indeed everywhere else as the US president warns nobody is getting off the hook. The tariffs will apparently be continuing regardless of whether morale improves, despite various somewhat confusing announcements of pauses, exceptions and so much more during the course of the last week or so. Well, US markets open, of course, at around 2:30 our time. Let's go to the Wall Street Journal's political economy columnist and a member of the paper's editorial board, Joseph Sternberg. Joseph, hello, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you.
Well, tell us then, is there actually a plan?
Oh, gosh. Not so far as anyone can tell at the moment. I think that there was a plan of sorts in the beginning, although kind of what the plan was would depend on who in the Trump administration you asked. I think a baseline condition here is that Trump himself has always believed in tariffs. This is actually the one thing, the one position he has consistently held for at least 40 years is that he thinks tariffs are a good thing. So definitely it was a certainty that he was going to push ahead with that. I think that you have people within his administration who think that you can use tariffs and broad-based tariffs of this sort that are intended to stay in place, that aren't just meant for negotiating leverage, to somehow rebalance America's economic relationship with the rest of the world. And they clearly wanted to push ahead with that idea. This is all colliding headlong with the reality that tariffs mean Americans will have to pay higher prices for things, and that is unpopular. So if it looks like there's confusion, it's because there's this conflict between the thing that they've all said for a long time they wanted to do and the equally obvious and predictable and unpopular consequence of that.
What was so weird about it was that it was sold, or it was attempted to be sold to the American public as a tax on other countries rather than a cost they would have to pay themselves. Why were consumers so gullible?
I think that it's important to understand there is actually a serious economic theory behind that argument, and it's arguable whether that is a good theory. But kind of the argument that the people in the protectionist camp in the U.S. were making is that if you have the tariffs, a consequence of that is that the dollar will rise in value, and other currencies in the tariffed countries will fall in value, and so that diminishes the purchasing power in these other places, and that's how China is meant to pay for the tariff. Now, I think there are a lot of problems with that theory, but I think that the key issue here is that a lot of Americans aren't accustomed to thinking about trade policy in this way, because it's decades since we had a serious argument about tariffs, and it's many, many decades since we had tariffs at any level, even vaguely approaching what we have now. So I think that there is an element of American voters sort of having had this vague notion that the tariff might be good because it would somehow help to bring manufacturing back, but not having had any experience in a couple generations with this.
Yeah, and what about the idea that do people in America want manufacturing jobs?
Well, see, that's the great befuddlement I and a lot of other people have about the situation, because, on the one hand, there is an enormous amount of nostalgia in America for the manufacturing economy, and particularly a lot of nostalgia that's rooted in the 1950s and 60s, which is now perceived as a golden age for America's industrial economy. And clearly a lot of that manufacturing has left the U.S., but America still has an enormous manufacturing sector in the economy. And in fact, manufacturing is one of those areas where employers consistently report that they are having trouble filling vacancies. So you can argue that, whatever has happened to the size of manufacturing in America already before the tariffs, there were more manufacturing jobs than Americans were prepared to fill. And yet, we have this political phenomenon of this nostalgia for that era, which might be about other things entirely. It might be about about this perception that somehow the economy has become less secure in general. It's not clear to me how much of it is really about people desperately wanting to go back to work in factories.
There is so much confusion over the tariffs. Over the weekend, we were told that there were going to be these exemptions. Today, I think there are rumours that the exemptions are going to be removed. What do you understand is likely to happen or could happen later on today, Joseph?
Well, I'm not even going to venture a guess on that because it could just as easily change 5 minutes after we wrap up this conversation. I think that the key thing to keep in mind over the days and weeks and maybe even months ahead is that you have this collision of Trump's real abiding conviction that tariffs are the right thing for America to do. The collision between that and the reality that Americans have become accustomed to paying lower prices for things because we import them. And, people can talk about this nostalgia I was describing for the American economy of the 1950s and 60s. Does that nostalgia outweigh people's desires not to pay $2,400 for an iPhone? I think it's doubtful, and I think that that's going to be kind of the political phenomenon that will be playing itself out.
There are, of course, many, many dissenting voices in the States. I think over the weekend, the Democrat Senator Elizabeth Warren just came out with it and said there is no tariff policy. It's just all chaos and corruption. That is all we have going on. There are plenty of people in that camp, aren't there?
Yes, I mean, this is proving to be enormously controversial, and I think that's arguably a good thing because, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, it is generations since Americans had a debate of this sort about free trade and what kind of economy we Americans want to have, and what kind of trade and other economic policies we need to get there. Now, it's also important to understand in the American system, the Congress does have a lot of authority. We are in this jam right now because Congress has ceded a lot of authority over trade issues. They've delegated that to the president, to the executive administration. Congress could reclaim a lot of that power. Now, I mean, you mentioned Elizabeth Warren. We do have to point out in the interest of fairness that Democrats like Senator Warren are making hay out of this issue right now. They passed on a lot of opportunities to reverse the first bunch of Trump tariffs during President Biden's administration, and Democrats in Congress have not exactly been free traders either. So I think that this debate is going to be clarifying on both sides of the aisle.
And while we have you with us, Joseph, there was that really genuinely horrifying Russian missile attack that killed 35 Ukrainian people in Sumy yesterday. An entire family, we understand, wiped out in that attack. This was Donald Trump's reaction.
Well, I think it was terrible, and I was told they made a mistake, but I think it's a horrible thing. I think the whole war is a horrible thing. I think the war is, for that war to have started, is an abuse of power. This country would have never allowed that war to have started if I were president.
A mistake, he said. What are we to make of that?
Oh, well, I think that kind of language is inexcusable in this kind of situation. And I think it's reflective of the fact that on Russia and Ukraine, Trump has brought into his circle of advisors people who have a very skewed concept of who is ultimately responsible for this war, meaning, Vladimir Putin started it. And Putin has prosecuted this invasion of a sovereign country in a particularly brutal way. And I do sense perhaps the Trump administration is starting to grapple with the fact that they put themselves on the brutal side of this conflict. But yeah, Trump needs to get with the program soon here.
Thank you very much indeed, Joseph. Joseph Sternberg of the Wall Street Journal.